Thank you so much for having me. I love talking to this group. It's an incredible group, and everybody has such great input and insight and feedback, and it's wonderful. So I was excited when I was asked to return, and you specifically asked me to address show, don't tell, because this is an ongoing problem for writers, especially, I think, a little bit from the Christian community, because we have kind of gotten used to telling more than showing because we always want to make a point or have a message with our story. Which, hey, of course we do because we have something powerful to say. But there's a way to do it, I believe, that can make our work better and more powerful. So, what I did was this is what you're about to get today is brand new, hot off the press, me thinking through some recent critiques, everything that I've been doing with clients and that sort of thing, and coming up with something fresh just for this group. Trying to come up with, well, okay, what can I boil this down to? So it's hot off the presses just for you guys. And I'm really excited about it because I think it's really good stuff. So I hope you will think so too. So what I did was I started looking at my last, say, 7 to 10 critiques of manuscripts in particular, because I assume most people in your group are writing manuscripts and are not necessarily writing screenplays. And so I wanted to come up with what are some of the common mistakes that I see in this particular area and what are the solutions? What are the ways that these things could be solved? So I'm going to give you five. Okay, so we're going to just dive right in. So number one of the first things that I think people can do when they're trying to show and not tell is that you turn an informational scene into a dialogue scene. And what I mean by that is that instead of telling the audience or the reader something through the mind of the character, through the character's thoughts, you find a way to create that scene as a dialogue scene. And by the way, this is tricky because we can do things in manuscript that we can't ever do in screenplays. In a manuscript, everything that we learn about the world is filtered through the character's head. It just is. Even if it's a third, you're writing in the third person, it's still coming through the character's head in a way. It's like that's how we get all of the information. And so that's why I think it becomes really easy, if you will, to tell us a bunch of stuff from the point of view of the character's head, because that's already naturally part of the process when you're writing a manuscript. However, there are times when you can arrest that process and change it so that we're gleaning the information through a dialogue scene that you can naturally set up between one character and another. And all of a sudden, the information as it comes to us is much more dynamically presented. So for example, and I'm so embarrassed, I keep talking about my novel that I'm working on. How long has it been? 8 years, 9 years? I mean, I'm a screenwriter. I'm not a novelist. So I'm mad props, huge respect for those of you writing books, because clearly it's taken me a long time. Nevertheless, I still dabble on it from time to time. And so recently I was dabbling, and one of the scenes that I had was almost entirely from the point of view of the character's head. And I was giving information about the world from that character's head. So I applied this rule to myself. And what I discovered is that there's another character in the scene that it was very organic for that character to ask a question that would launch into this sort of information being shared that also could be shared in a way where there was conflict in the dialogue. And let me share what that looked like. So part of it was my main character, Percy. He's very athletically built. He was made by the master. He's got perfect limbs, all these things. He's been transformed into a living being. But Wilbur, who has also been transformed by the master, is not. Wilbur is a monstrosity. He is an awkward, awful looking creature. He looks like a deranged pet. And of course, Percy cannot understand why the master would have created this monstrosity of Wilbur. However, Wilbur also is just a beautiful character. He's so tenacious. He's so sweet. He's like the embodiment of good. And there are reasons why the master created him, even though he's a monstrosity. But what happens is in the book, the first version, I had all of that information coming to us from Percy directly to the audience. And what I did is I put it in the context of a dialogue scene where now Percy has to try to explain to Wilbur why he's basically disabled. He doesn't have the physical abilities of a normal person. He never will. And why would the master have created him that way? And actually, what I found is that not only was it more dynamic, it was beautiful and powerful in a way that I hadn't anticipated. In fact, it even made me emotional at one point because Percy's trying to explain this to this sweet, innocent Wilbur who just can't understand his own limitations. And it turned out to be incredibly dynamic, way more than it ever would have been had I kept it from the point of view of just the character's head. So what I then did after I did that is I realized, wow, I bet you there's other places I could do that. And sure enough, I went back through and there were so many places in my manuscript where I had stuff just right directly in the character's head, but there was an opportunity to bring it out in dialogue. Now, I haven't made all those corrections yet, but I intend to because I believe that just that automatically makes it more vivid. Now, you might be asking, well, how is that show don't tell? Well, I'll tell you, one way that it's show don't tell is because if I can couch the conversation correctly, I am showing internal struggle. I'm showing conflict. I'm showing relational development. I'm showing all those through the dialogue scene. I'm also able then to show things like character reactions, things like Percy getting frustrated and almost getting gruff with Wilbur because he doesn't want to have to talk about these things because it's embarrassing to him, but it also hurts him to have to hurt Wilbur and he doesn't want to do that, and so I'm able to show that in a way that I couldn't have the other way. So it is a show don't tell. Now, it might not be the typical way that we're thinking of show don't tell, and yet it really is. The other part about it that is show don't tell is that if you can put that dialogue conversation in a way where there is something else going on in the scene rather than two talking heads, now you have another layer of show don't tell. So, for example, in the scene with Percy and Wilbur, they're not just sitting around having this conversation. While they're doing it, Percy has been wounded and Wilbur is actually helping him, like doing first aid on him, kind of trying to clean him up, which is also ironic counterpoint because the stuff that Percy has been able to do that would even render him wounded, Wilbur would never be able to do. And yet here we're also showing I'm never bringing this up. The whole conversation is about the deficiencies of Wilbur. And yet what we're actually seeing is that Percy needs Wilbur and that Wilbur has something powerful to bring to the table that neither of them have actually even noticed. And so I'm offering a show that adds a deeper level of meaning in my story because I'm also couching that scene in a visual way. So all of those things, I think, are one mind-blowing way to show, don't tell in your scene. So find a way to take scenes that take place in the head, find a way to turn them into dialogue scenes or make them a conversation, and then couch that conversation in a dynamic context, something visual that allows the scene to unfold in an organic but more meaningful way. And that's what I love about it too. It's an easy I mean, it isn't easy. I mean, writing is easy. You just open up a vein and bleed all over the page. It isn't easy, but it is simple in that regard. It's not like this huge idea that makes it really hard to wrap your brain around. So everybody can sink their teeth into this one. Okay. Number 2, I'm constantly seeing manuscripts where the scenes are not necessarily motivated from one to the next. There's not a bridge going in from one to the next. And I think that that is a really good opportunity for us to create visual stuff that's show, don't tell, but also meaningful content by how you bridge scenes. Now, what do I mean by that? So what I'm talking about is finding a way to motivate the next scene by how you end the previous one. Something needs to prompt us to go into the next scene, the new area. We have to justify that. We have to connect it somehow. And by the way, this is sometimes something that has to be done more on a rewrite than on the first time out, right? So the first time out, blah, we just bleed all, we just vomit on the page. Or sometimes we don't even write in order, right? Like, I'm going to write this scene. And so then we lay out all those scenes and we, at some point, try to put them in the right order, but they're not necessarily prompting the next one, us going into that. It's just, they just happen to be laid out that way. But so now on a rewrite, the challenge would be to go back and find a way to connect the scene, find a way to end the scene so that it naturally or organically prompts us to go into the next scene. There's a connection there. Now, the connection doesn't have to be overt. The connection can be very subtle. For example, you could actually visually connect it. Maybe I'm going to end the scene with a gal washing her hands. She's obsessed with washing her hands. We just see her in the bathroom and trying to get something out of her hands. And then we end on that visual image of the washing of the hands. And then maybe the next scene, if it's organic, and again, we have to figure out what would be good. I mean, this takes a little bit more thought, but maybe we start on somebody being baptized, or maybe somebody who is in a waterfall playing, standing underneath the waterfall, or I don't know. So somehow I'm taking the water and the cleanliness image and I'm trying to find a way to connect it visually, even though I'm not overtly saying that. I'm not making any overt statements about it. The truth is, our audiences are sophisticated. Now, you shouldn't do this to be just creative. It should be connected. In those visual images that you're coming up with, there needs to be a reason for it that actually makes sense, or else it'll be a red herring, because we can't help but to derive meaning from things, certainly from visuals. And by the way, an aside, I had a debate with somebody recently on Facebook about this sort of idea, because this person is advocating for absurdist material. And actually, the conversation came out of the Academy Award-winning film Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I loathed, for the record. I thought it was a terrible movie on a number of levels. And one of the reasons I thought it was terrible is because it was gratuitously perverse, because of certain images that they brought into the world that were just unnecessary, and they were gratuitous. It was just gross. It didn't have to happen. And so I was arguing that I thought that it was certainly pandering to the Academy. It was pandering to culture, a lot of the themes of this thing, but also image-wise, there was no mythology that really made sense. You couldn't understand the rules of the universe. I thought it tried really hard to be profound with its themes, but really it was offering a very banal message, trite. It wasn't deep at all. And I think one of the scariest parts about this film is how everybody thinks it's so deep, and it really isn't. It's really silly. And so I just couldn't believe that. And the acting was phenomenal. I can say that. The acting was phenomenal. I think Jamie Lee Curtis blew the world away with her performance. And I agree with that. But that doesn't mean the film was good. So, one of my reasons, though, is because of the use of visual images. Because, and this is what I was arguing to this other person, is that Christians can't actually write absurd. And in fact, I don't think any writers can, because when you're writing something absurd, you're actually saying there's meaning here for you to derive. And a truly absurdist piece would be absent of meaning because it would be absurd. It would be nonsensical. It would be chaos. But as writers, we're crafting something. So even writers, it's a non-attainable goal for an actual writer, because even the writers that are trying to craft something that is absurdist ultimately are trying to say something with that absurdist piece, which then undermines the whole purpose. So the reason I say that is because when we come back to this particular point of creating a visual image somehow to connect the scenes, we can't just have a random visual image. It's got to be one that we are intentionally endowing the piece with meaning without ever talking about it, by the way. And that's the point. Please don't undermine your own brilliance. If you come up with a great visual image to connect your scenes, don't undermine your own brilliance by then commenting on it. That will defeat the purpose. The best thing you can do as a writer is just create it and let the audience be the one to pick up on it or not. And here's the thing. Usually they'll pick up on something that is exactly what we're trying to say. Notice in the example I gave that I made up off the top of my head, I started with the thing of her cleaning her hands. So that naturally meant I needed to have some sort of cleaning image, right? In the next thing, like a person being baptized or even somebody, standing under a waterfall in a pristine lake. There's got to be some sort of image that enhances that or goes along with that, but that would need to come out of the text itself. I couldn't just tack that on. So it's better to not have that than to artificially tack something on that doesn't fit. But when you can find that, wow, it can really up the quality of your writing. It can really take something that is good into the realm of excellence. I fully believe that, because it is going to another level of artistry. So connecting it visually is one way. A less difficult way to connect your scenes is thematically, or just simply from the chronological or context point of view. So for example, let's say you have two characters that are trying to find some sort of bad guy, and they have this key piece of evidence, and so they're getting their supplies because they're going to head out. And this is where you might have those last quippy lines or something where it's like, if we can't find him, the whole world is going to suffer. Well, let's just hope that we can make him suffer first. I mean, that's terrible. That's terrible, terrible, right? But let's just pretend that it wasn't as terrible as it was. But then we cut to, and that's what it is in my brain. See, I'm a screenwriter, but we cut to, but that's what it is. It is a cut to, maybe we now see the character and now the character that we're after. So now it's a natural cut to that character because we've just been talking about them in the scene before. And then we're adding another level to it and making it more visual by ending on the thing where, well, let's just hope that we can make him suffer. And then maybe we show him, eating grapes and having the time of his life, which again is ironic counterpoint. He ain't suffering at all, right? But nevertheless, it's motivated, and now it's delightful. It's delightful. You see how delightful that is? Even though it was badly written, it was delightful. Badly written in my brain as I said it out loud. All right. So the point is, we need to be looking for ways to connect our scenes that are more organic, more motivated, and just connected somehow. And I'm just giving you 3 sub ways to do that: visually, thematically, or chronologically / contextually. So if we're talking about a particular character at the end, then it's a natural way to go to that character once we go to the next scene. Or if we're looking at a certain thing, then we can go, to something similar. You get the point. The idea being that we're just looking for a better way to connect these scenes, to bring it all together, because it is part of a bigger whole and it will add a deeper level of meaning to your story. And it is a way to show without telling if you resist the temptation to actually comment on it. Okay, I shall pause here for any questions, comments, concerns. Anything in the chat?
Zena, when you said that, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, Norma.
Um, that when you said about resisting the urge to talk about it, reminded me Jerry Jenkins used to say, resist the urge to explain.
Yes,
And that the same thing here. Resist the urge to try to draw it out so much, give your reader a little bit of credit. I think that's a
that's
great point.
exactly right. Because it actually, yes, I love that. See, I'm brilliant like Jerry Jenkins. I'm glad to know this. This is good for me. Thank you. No, I'm just
You're
kidding.
welcome.
But it's what happens too is when we do that, when we comment on it, not only are we robbing the reader of the joy of having figured that out or saw that. See, what you do is you rob them of their joy. You rob them of their bragging rights. Because when they're talking to other people about your book, they want to be able to tell them what they got. And you rob them of that if you explain to them so that everybody gets it. It's more exciting for the reader when they see it. And now they get to be like, guess what I saw? Guess what I figured out? And aren't we like that? Like, we love that. So,
Now, how do you balance not explaining to the reader and being too abstract that they don't get enough of the material?
it is the $1 million question, isn't it?
I guess so.
So, I mean, that's why we have beta readers. The beta readers hopefully will help us to see if we didn't give enough information. That does happen. I mean, rarely does it happen. I find that most people over explain. But nevertheless, once in a while, you know what? That's not a true statement. That is not a true statement. I take that back. It depends on the writer and it depends on the genre a lot. Sometimes people over explain. Sometimes people don't give me enough information. So both are a problem. Here's something I try to do. Of course, this is screenwriting. I try to show character behavior and reactions without being cryptic. Sometimes we can try to be cryptic. I don't try to be cryptic about it. Like if the character, makes an expression like, or scoffs or whatever, I'll say that, which naturally is going to make the reader or audience interpret the emotion and how that character is feeling about the situation or whatever. So I don't try to be cryptic. I don't try to be clever. I try to be clear. What I don't do is, I think when you go outside of the character's experience, that's when we, the author, are participating in what I call author intrusion. That's when we're trying to speak into the text and really, and like almost subjugate the character and transplant the character for a moment to try to speak directly to the reader. And that's when I think that's when we fail. So I wouldn't worry too much about describing what the character is doing or how they're reacting. It's when you are supplanting them and trying to speak to the reader. I find that that's mostly when it happens. But that's just off the top of my head. So that's a great question. And it's the $1 million question. If everybody could do it, everybody would do it. All right, let's go to number 3. If you must have the thoughts of that character happening on the page, then it should happen in the midst of action. Again, there are times, because everything in a novel comes to us through the character's brain. There's times where we're going to be in the character's head. But what you can't do, and Susan May Warren and I have talked about this, like you can't just have a character in their rocking chair rocking and thinking all these thoughts. I mean, that's just not a dynamic scene. They have to be doing something. So, for example, I recently critiqued a sci-fi novel that really has great potential. I really like this author. He's very talented. But in his opening sequence, he tells us a lot of information just through the character's head. And he even has it in the midst of action, sort of, but it's action that sort of peters out. And then we just stay in this one moment for a really long time while all this stuff is happening. And so the story is not moving forward. And so what I encouraged him to do was to rework that opening chapter where we actually get to see more about the character, who they are inside, as we're learning these things about the world. Because, see, it's sci-fi, and so there's so much he's trying to get us to understand about the world itself. So in this situation, what had happened was he had a character who is a master thief. It's set way in the future, and it's a very controlling society. And so this person has gone in and stolen the database of all of the DNA that's being stored in the master database or whatever. She's stolen that piece so that they can do something that's like a DNA blocker so people can move without being detected by Big Brother. And so it's a pretty big thieving operation, pretty big deal. And so now she's meeting in a secret clandestine location with the powers that be, the underworld rebellion, who is wanting to wage a war against these controlling, the upper tier. And so they're meeting for this exchange where she's going to get the money and they're going to get the database and all's going to be well. But while they're there, all of a sudden the drones come in, the cops come in, and they start coming down on bungees. They get attacked. And so she takes off running, and then she just runs for several pages, and we get all the thoughts about the world for several pages. Okay, so it's very action-oriented to begin with, but then we just run for several pages, and we're just in her head. So what I encouraged him to do was rethink this. She's got to be smart enough to know that there's a chance that they're going to get caught, and if they're caught, what's going to happen? What are the stakes? So that means she would have planned ahead. In fact, there's maybe even a chance that somebody within the rebellion might be a plant. Like if this is such a super powerful government organization, maybe there are plants that would catch her, people that are double agents. So she would have to think ahead because a character is reactive, and that's true, but then we have to make them active again anyway. That's a huge part of story. Even if they're reacting to something that happens, now they have to somehow still try to drive the action and take back the action, take back the control of the story. So they're driving the action. So in this case, what if she's planned ahead? She's planted explosives around the perimeter of this meeting. She's done that in advance just in case. And then, of course, when the RoboCops comes pouring down out of their ships or whatever, now she is able to take off, but she knows where she's going to go. She runs around this corner. They're all in hot pursuit, but she slides to the ground underneath this dugout hole where she's got the explosives. She waits for the RoboCops to get right in just the right place, and then boom, she blows up the explosive, which then does the double duty of now causing debris and smoke to go into the air, which is going to prevent the drones from being able to find her. Now she's got a little bit of a time to make it to the next place where she's already pre-planned that she will go if this happens. So now we're in the midst of action as this is happening, and we can still be in her head because she's alone. She doesn't have anyone to talk to. We're just getting her thoughts, but it's thoughts that are in the midst of this action-oriented thing that makes sense, that's part of the story, that's really exciting, right? That's really exciting, and the stakes are high. And so as she's now noticing that the debris, she's got proper coverage, now she's dashing to the tunnel that she knows she can reach before the debris is gone. And as she's running, she's thinking about, I've got to get to my mom. They know who I am now. My name is going to be plastered all over the planet. And that means they're going to go after my mom, and they're going to question her for my location. They're going to torture her. they're probably already there, which means to watching the house. They probably haven't gone in and gotten her yet, but once they know that this mission has gone bad, then they're going to go in and grab her. So I've got to immediately send the code. And so she, gets on her little wrist pad thing and she sends a secret code that she's planned with her mother in advance. Maybe her mother doesn't even know exactly what she does, but she's planned out with her mother. If you ever get a code that says, I'm going teddy bear shopping, it means go to this place in advance, a safe house or whatever. So she's trying to do that, but doggone it, she can't get the signal or whatever. And there's an obstacle. So now she's got to do the next thing and she's got to do the next thing. So we're learning about the world even as this is happening. And that's going to make it dynamic. So anytime we have to have the thoughts of the characters, they should happen amidst action. They can't just sit around thinking about things. They must be doing something. They must be doing something. And they must be driving the action. And so here's another example of this. Again, my own little novel that I dabble in. My opening scene is Percy, who has to go into the compound of Old Man Magruder, and he's trying to also steal an object from Old Man Magruder, who is an evil, evil person in the future, because Percy's trying to escape. He's trying to take he and Wilbur and escape from the place where they are. And so that he needs this one particular item, which means he's got to risk life and limb to go into the compound to steal this thing. But as I have him up on the tree branches, surveilling and all of this, I am giving information about the world that is naturally motivated from the current action. He picks up the World War III goggles, the antique World War III goggles of his master. So that's giving information about the world, but it's organic, given to the scene, and it's just a little bit, but it's still showing stuff without telling, and it's still part of it driving the action. But then I'll allow him to go into a memory of something with the master that's basically past. I'm revealing the past in the present, but it's motivated by the present, but I can't stay there too long. I have about a paragraph maybe to let him go there that is giving the audience really necessary information. And then I've got to get him out of there and back into the present and the next thing that he has to do. And then there can be another thing that is about the world. Like I talk about Old Man Magruder being part of the new Highlands and the criminal underground that's developed in the wake of the incessant warfare and blah, 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 blah. And I talk about Old Man Magruder and I describe him and some of his tactics and how he likes to maim people and blah, blah, blah. And this is a children's novel. So anyway, the point is that when you have these moments of being in the character's head, when you can design them around action that is motivated in the present, it doesn't feel like we are stagnant. It feels like the story is still moving forward, and all of that starts to feel organic. It all starts to feel really, really good to the reader. They don't feel like they're being spoon-fed. And that's one of the tricks, I think, of getting good exposition, by the way, is that you couch it in present action. The best exposition is couched in present action and dialogue. A dialogue scene would be present action. We don't want to lose the urgency of the scene, so we want to keep propelling the scene forward in action. All right. Yes, maybe mom has an escape hatch underground. Yes, good, Laurie. Woo-woo. I just pulled up the chats. Okay, so the point number 3 is that if you must have the thoughts of the characters, you couch it in the midst of action. You try to put it in the midst of ongoing action where they are driving the scene forward. The scene must be being propelled forward. Okay.
Leslie had a question earlier. She asked, if you're showing a lot, does it not take the deeper emotion away from the character? I get that you have to show action, but how do you show the deeper emotions in an action?
Oh, that's great. So no, it doesn't take away from the emotion. I don't believe if you are also showing us character reactions. So, for example, because I'm a screenwriter, this is ingrained in me. In screenwriting, we have a rule that you guys don't have in novel writing, but I think it would be a good rule for you to adopt. It would actually, I think, help your material. And that is, you can never tell me what a character is feeling. Never, ever tell me what they're feeling. You can only show me through their behavior. So if a character is sad, I have to physicalize that in behavior. I have to figure out what they are doing that the audience would interpret that behavior as sadness. Now, sadness can be complex, right? Sadness can be, I mentioned the Percy and Wilbur thing. Well, there's a moment where Percy, he gets really gruff with Wilbur, really kind of rough and, okay, get on, pushes him away, shoves him off, moves his arm like with the new bandage and just like really is kind of rough with Wilbur. But that's behavior that I'm describing that I never actually say what Percy is really feeling about Wilbur. And really what Percy is feeling is helpless. He cares about Wilbur desperately, and it makes him angry that he can't help Wilbur. And so anger is always a secondary emotion. The real emotion underneath is always either fear or sadness. It's one of those two things. And I think for Percy, it's both. But really, I think he's afraid for Wilbur more than anything because he's taken it upon himself to try to help Wilbur, even though he could escape by himself if he wanted to. But no, he can't do that to Wilbur. He can't abandon him. And so there's fear for both of them, but there's a lot of fear for will Wilbur survive once they get out of here? How's this going to work? But he has to take the risk. And so my point is I'm showing his reactions without ever commenting on them. And believe me, that will draw your audience in more. We tend to underestimate what describing character behavior will do, but I promise you, I've never had a situation, I can't even think of a single example where I've read a character reacting a certain way and I wish the author would have spelled that out for me more. I can't think of a single time where I've thought, they really should tell me that the character is sad or anything like that. I never have that. And when it's done correctly, I feel it. That's what bonds me to the character. That is the emotional connection that they've made with me because now I'm invested because they didn't need to tell me how he felt. I got it and I felt it too. So I think it's actually far more powerful, but it is a tricky thing. So the key is to really try to focus on the behaviors. And this is why I'm not opposed to microscopic descriptions in story. We can't do it as much in screenplays. But what I mean by that is those sentences that say something like, there was a nearly imperceptible twitch of the eye, where the character is so in tune that they see an almost imperceptible twitch. Now he knows that the bad guy is disturbed underneath the cool facade. And that's awesome when we get to see those things. And again, we're getting it through the main character's point of view because they're the ones that are observing the world and then translating it to us. So him noticing even something microscopically like that is showing us, but notice he's showing that through behavior rather than telling us, yeah, this guy is really, really disturbed deep down. We just can't see it, that sort of thing. So I would try that. I would try limiting yourself so that you can only describe character behavior. See what that does for it. That's a great way to show and not tell. Okay, number 4. This one probably seems logical or obvious. It isn't because I'm seeing a lot of things come in that aren't having this. And this is kind of, this is really rule number 1 or ground level stuff. But basically, you simply must describe the setting. You must describe where we are. We have to have an idea of where we are in every single scene. Now, we don't need to know everything. And I know we talk about the five senses, right? Like what you see, what you smell, what you taste, what you feel, what you hear. Yes, there's five. And you might not need all of them at all scenes. You might not. You have to sometimes pick and choose. Nevertheless, you simply have to set up, you need to help us to see physically where the character is oriented. If you don't do that, it will lend yourself to talking heads. It will produce this, we're only in the character's head. It's not just for the reader, it's for you. Because when you create the environment, now the character can interact with it. If you don't take the time to create the environment, there's nothing for them to interact with, and you're more prone to just stay stuck in the character's head. So do yourself a favor and create the setting. Now, what I've noticed too is a lot of times there is a disconnect between the physical environment that the writer is creating and, say, the action that's unfolding. Let me see if I can explain this. For example, I remember somebody turned in a critique where they had a character pulling up in the car. One character was pulling up in the car while these other two characters were standing there waiting for the car to approach. And I mean, the two characters that are waiting for the car to approach had this majorly long dialogue scene. So, I mean, they're putting it in a dialogue scene and everything. And yet, I remember writing, well, how far away did this guy park? How far away is this drive? How long does it take? Like, this seems imminent. The timing has to be right for the physical location that you've created, or else it undermines the reality and the credibility of the story. So we have to be mindful of that physical space and make sure that we are giving it dimension in that way. And we're cognizant of the reality of the limits too. But that will really help us to understand the story, and it will really help us to show and not tell. What we taste is not necessarily relevant to every scene. But in scenes where you have the sharp taste of metal in your mouth, that could really be a wonderful way to show that something's wrong. It's that metallic sense of death, There could be something there. It's a foreshadowing. It adds a level of suspense that takes your story to another level simply because they can taste that acrid metallic flavor. And then finally they find the room where there's piles and piles of dead bodies. Again, great material for a children's story. Kidding. Okay. I once had an author say that, this particular person, this was a relatively recent critique, and he never set up any scene that he was in. He never gave me any sense of environment. Never. And I commented on that, and he said, well, I skip all that when I read it, so I don't put it in for my reader. I think it's boring. Oh, okay. Well, it ain't boring to me, and maybe you're reading the wrong books. Because the books I'm reading, that's not boring. It's essential. And really, if you're super bored with that sort of thing and you want to just get to the dialogue, then maybe you need to be writing something else. Maybe not manuscripts. Because the whole point of a novel is that you have to be able to create that space. You have to be able to create that. My other author, the sci-fi author, when I asked him about this, because he had all this great action, but then he never actually described where we were. It's like he made assumptions that we would just know. And we do that sometimes. Sometimes it's so clear in our head that we don't actually take the time to describe it for the audience. We just assume they get it. And I asked, and he said, oh yeah, I just didn't take the time to do it. I kind of just thought, I guess I thought everybody was there with me. Oh yeah. Like he didn't even notice he'd missed doing it. So we want to make sure to do that. Okay. So again, that's number 4. Basically just taking the time to set up the environment, what we see, all those things. All right. So lastly, number 5, you must think of each scene as a little mini story with an arc of its own. And here's the important part of this. The character must change over the course of even that scene. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, this can be a very small, small thing. This is actually something I learned to articulate. I knew it intuitively, but I didn't know to articulate it until I was working with Susie May Warren on her screenplay. And this is when it hit me. I was like, oh, I know what's missing. Because she had these great scenes. Everything in her screenplay, it should have made sense. It should have worked. But there was something missing. And I realized what it was. It's that in her scenes, she was using the scenes visually, all those things to establish what the character was, but nothing happened internally, emotionally to that character. I mean, they did later, but in the beginning, in her opening sequences, the characters weren't changing. It wasn't changing. And therefore, the cuts to the next scenes weren't motivated. See, this is part of what motivates us going to the next scene is that the character ends the scene in a slightly modified emotional place. That's when you know. By the way, a lot of people don't know when to get out of a scene. It's when that moment happens, when they come to a new place, when there is a new understanding, and it can be very, very subtle. But, for example, just using Susie May Warren's screenplay as an example, I'm sure she wouldn't mind. She lets me use her video of our session in my class, so I know she wouldn't mind. She's so wonderful. But there was a scene where she was showing the main female character. She wanted to show that this gal, all she thought about was work. The rest of the world was going on. The rest of the world everywhere was alive. They were all doing stuff, but she was just so absorbed in her work. She's a lawyer, and she was missing life. And so that's what she showed. You know, she's on the fire escape in New York doing her homework and missing all the stuff that's going on around her. And then they cut to the romantic lead. And I said, okay, something's missing here because nothing actually happened in that scene to make us go to the next guy. Nothing changed for the character. And all we needed to see was like, as she was researching, all it was that she noticed something in the material. And now the scene accomplished something emotionally, internally for that character. So that's the key. Every scene has to accomplish something emotionally for that character before you can move on. And that's the whole point of the scene. If they start the scene in one emotional place and they end it somewhere else. Now, there is an exception here. Yes. Do you want to ask that question?
Well, I was just going to ask, how does that apply when you have a character with a flat change arc? And maybe you were going there.
Okay, good. So there is an exception here, which is if your character doesn't change and they stay in the same place, then you have to put something in that scene that changes the audience's experience. So let me give you an example. Let's say I have a character who is, hey, let's say it's Little Red Riding Hood. Right? And Little Red Riding Hood is do. She's got her little basket of treats and she's going into the forest and she's oblivious to the dangers. Do. She's going out there. But then I would show someone watching her through the leaves and the crunching of the leaves or whatever on the ground. And now the audience goes, she's in danger. So even though Little Red Riding Hood is oblivious, we're not. So someone has to have an emotional shift. And if it's not the character, it has to be the audience. Does that make sense? So you have to craft it in such a way that is going to give us a new experience. And again, that's what makes the scene complete because somebody is exchanging one emotional state for another. And that ups the stakes for everybody and it propels the story forward. And it is a huge part of showing and not telling in story. So those are my 5 mind-blowing tips on how to show and not tell in story. I think they're all very, very doable, very practical, immediately applicable. Hopefully, you can even be seeing things right now. You can go back to your work in progress and see ways that you can do that. Any questions?
And Zena, this has been one. First of all, I love your imagination and your enthusiasm. It just doesn't, you empower us
Thank you.
better writer. So thank
That's
you.
awesome.
Thank you for that. Norma, do you want to kind of handle questions or pass things around?
I sure can. I have a question I'd like to ask you, Zena. In a fiction story that I'm working on, like you, it's like yours. It's been many, many years, but I have a scene where the the heroine of my story leaves work and gets into a car and ends up being followed on the highway.
Okay.
So, how in describing that scene, the opening of that, how would you do that? Like, would you
Well,
describe
I
the
mean,
plot, or would you
what's the genre?
romantic suspense?
Manic suspense. Okay. By the way, this is my dog snoring in the background. She's very, very loud. Yes, she's snoring right next to me.
Good.
Okay. So I mean, typically, if she notices while she's driving that she's being followed. She doesn't know initially, right? So that's definitely an emotional change that happens in the scene. It's like, she gets out and, uh, probably she's got 1,000 things on her mind. She's thinking about her sister. She's thinking about, gosh, that cat down the road. I wonder if it's okay, the neighbor's cat that went to the vet. I should probably fix lunch for that person at church. And oh gosh, oh man, I forgot to pick up the laundry. And I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's on her mind, but she's distracted in all these things. And maybe as she pulls out, that's the first time you see she happens to notice a car, doesn't think much of it. And next thing you know, she's driving along and she happens to, she's still lost in thought and she slams on her brakes because the car in front of her stops and then she looks in her rearview mirror to make sure the person's not going to rear end her and then she notices that car that's odd and that looked like the car from the neighborhood or whatever. And now she's driving along and she's headed to work and then she turns and then she notices that car that's 3 back. It also turns and so now we're amping it up and now we're in her head like, well, is this car following me or is this just my imagination? I mean, everybody says, I shouldn't read all these mystery novels, but boy, this certainly seems like it. And so now she conducts a test. And notice, by the way, now she's not just passive because what we've had to do is something happened to her. And this happens a lot, I find, in story where we start out with this, a character. This has to happen where something happens. But now how do you take it back and make sure that character drives the action? And so in this case, what's happening is she's noticed that she might be being followed. So maybe first she's going to test that. And when she figures out, oh crap, I am being followed. Now what is she going to do about it? It depends on the character, right? So maybe she picks up her cell phone to call 911 and she's like, wait a minute, I can't call 911. I'm wanted. I mean, I'm making this up. Maybe that option isn't open to her. Maybe it is. And if that's what she would do, or maybe she suspects she knows who it is, in which case, how big of a threat? It just depends on the variables and the factors. If she's worried about her life, then maybe she drives to a police station. Maybe the guy then realizes that she's where she's headed and tries to block her off. And now she's got to try to outdrive him and she's got to lose him. And she gets on the freeway and she's going to wreck. And so she gets off the freeway and now she doesn't know where she is and she doesn't know where the police station is. And she's trying to drive, but then, he swerves over, he hits the car and she drops her cell phone. So now she can't reach it to call. And now what is she going to do? And then she sees a mall. And at least there's people there. She screeches to a halt in the fire lane and then jumps out of the car and runs inside, yelling, help, help, help. And then watches through the doors as the car stops and then finally drives away because she couldn't call the cops because she dropped the phone. I mean, all those things. But it just depends if she's really worried about her life or if she suspects that maybe it's somebody following her who is a private eye that is trying to get information from her. So maybe it's okay, they don't know that I know that they're on to me or that they're following me. So now I can give misinformation. And so now she smiles and she was in the turning lane. She was going to turn right, but instead she goes straight and she takes him somewhere else and she's going to take him on a wild goose chase. And maybe she ends up, she has a way to ditch him somewhere and then she can go to the meeting she was going to without being tailed. and she's victorious. And then we get to show that side of her character. She ain't no dummy, and she's a smart cookie. It just depends on the variables. But does that help?
Absolutely. And actually, it was a ex-abusive husband that she's left, and he was trying to get to her. So I did have him chasing her on the highway. So I did some of the things that you said. So that's why I was kind of grinning real big when you were talking about that, because that's what I chose to do. But thank you.
So welcome.
And that in that, I wouldn't need to describe a car because everybody knows what the inside of the car looks like, right?
No, you don't need to describe the inside of her car. No, except for the thing is like you would describe the car as the action unfolded when it was necessary for the story. For example, if she's driving a Honda Accord stick shift and, she picks up her phone to dial, but then has to swerve and drops it in between the cracks, in between the bucket seats. And as she's trying to reach down there, she feels I don't know, the wires, and then the phone's stuck between the wires. So you end up describing some of that stuff only as it pertains to the action. But no, we don't. This is a truism. Like, don't describe stuff that isn't important. Just don't. If it doesn't play into the narrative in some way, don't describe it. Even when I said the setting and, that you want to take the time to set up the setting, you only are picking the things that are relevant to the scene, that are actually important to the scene. If you choose the wrong details, it will work against your scene. It will actually undermine your suspense and your dramatic potential. So you only want to choose the things that play into the narrative directly, which is why you don't have to describe everything all at once. I have a lot of people in screenwriting, for example, and they'll set a scene and then they'll try to show me everything up front instead of as the action unfolds. But one of the best things that you can do, one of the things that's so great about screenwriting is you can show a person, leaning up against a counter. And so we're interior kitchen day, and Joe is leaning up against the counter, turning a spoon in a glass of milk, and then taking a drink of milk, having a conversation. And then as Joe steps across the room for the first time, now all of a sudden we see that Bart is tied up, hog-tied on the kitchen floor as Joe stands over him drinking this milk and dipping his Oreo cookies and having this conversation. We don't have to show that all at once. We show it as the scene unfolds. And maybe the wallpaper is peeling on the walls and Joe is disgusted by that. And he's like, this place is a pigsty. And he rips off a piece of the wallpaper and tosses it on Bart's head or something. But we only show the wallpaper because it plays into the emotion or the action at the time. We wouldn't have to describe that otherwise. So you find ways to reveal as it's necessary. And we just have to have a good idea of where we are to begin with, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And by the
Does
way,
anyone
one
have
more
any
thing,
questions?
Norma, about that I will say is also make sure you know what the bad guy wants. Sometimes what we can do is we can have these characters doing things for the purposes of our character to react, but we're really not playing it out. What is the ex-husband's objective here? What is he trying to do? I mean, he's got to have he wants to kill her. Why now? I mean, that raises a bunch of questions. Why now? Why did he wait? Why did he wait until she got in the car? Why didn't he storm into the house? I think almost what would be better is if, he suspects that she's doing something that he disapproves of and he's hoping to catch her. And then when he gets caught chasing her, now he decides, now he gets violent, he snaps, but he's probably not there waiting out in the car to try to chase her and kill her there. He probably just, if he was going to just kill her, it has to be triggered in the scene. And probably what triggers, like, now she's got a restraining order against him, and now he's violated it because he's following her because he thinks she's having an affair and he wants to catch her. And he'll prove that she's awful and he'll hurt the lover too or whatever. But now if he thinks he's going to be caught and now he's going to get in trouble from the law, now that motivates why he's gone from I'm just going to follow her to I've got to kill her. So for what that's worth. You've got to logically play those things through and make sure that the objective makes sense for even your other characters.
Okay, this has just been great today. Zena, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This has been a wealth of information, but very practical and using. I can just tell by the comments and the numbers that we had today. People thoroughly. You are a teacher at heart, girl. You
Aw,
really are. Thank you
thank
so,
you.
so much. Thank you for being with us today and continue. Please keep writing. Thank you, everybody. Bye now.